Professor Jenet Erickson, thanks for talking to me today.
It's great to be here.
Tell us who you are and what you do.
I'm delighted to be here, Steve. My PhD's in family science. I'm part of the religious education faculty where I teach a class on the family. And my background, of course, is not in scripture, but we have the beautiful proclamation that is scripture for us. And that's the class that I teach on, is extensively covering the dimensions of that.
So you're a social scientist.
Yes.
You teach in the School of Family Life.
Yes,
as
also,
well,
yes.
right? At the same time, and also had a past faculty spot there.
Yes,
is that right?
that's
Great.
right.
Well, we are talking here today about your lead article in the most recent issue of BYU Studies. Thanks for writing it, publishing it. I happen to be editor-in-chief of BYU Studies, so I get to read all the good stuff that comes through and learn a lot, and get to have this opportunity to speak with you. Will you start by telling us the story of your article? How and why did you decide to research and write and publish this work?
Thank you, Steve. Some years ago, I was asked to help with an amicus brief for the Supreme Court, and it was dealing with family structure questions. And the question was, do we need fathers and mothers? Is there something about that male-female unit that's important culturally and to the development of children? And I was finished with my PhD, probably 10 years out, and I just was asked to study this, started diving deep into it, and it was a remarkable journey because I had not been taught about the distinct contributions of mothers and fathers in development. And there was a world of research that looked at observing fathers and how they relate differently to children, that looked at how characteristics of that home predict outcomes for children. And so I just consolidated it. As I was looking at it, I could see, oh my goodness, what's happening here is fathers and mothers bring distinct psychological and physiological orientations to the way they relate to children, and that they show up in these dimensions of development. When we look at human development, we usually break it up into social, emotional development, cognitive development, sexual and gender identity development, spiritual development. And I could see there's this incredible complementarity in each of these dimensions of development, where a father brings something unique from a mother, and that it provides a fullness in the development of that child. So I wrote that amicus brief. I kept studying it, and I found that students and others are desperate to hear. They have never heard. They've kind of witnessed, the distinctions between their mothers and fathers, but they don't know that it's a consistent pattern.
Right.
And yet they have some sense that men and women are different, and they value that. So talking about it with students has brought me a lot of joy. They always enjoy hearing this information. So that's how I got started. And it seemed like all the doctrine that we have around the importance of man and woman, that the eternal structure is male-female, that God is defined by a man-woman unit. But it's hard in our world to understand, why does that matter so much? Women are obviously capable in all kinds of ways. Men are capable in all kinds of ways. And there was a reaction, I think, to the fact that over periods of time after industrialization, where you had men outside the home, women inside the home, and this division of life and work, and then she's conscripted to this narrow space, that a reaction to that in some ways meant an obscuring of what they do that's important in development. So when we think about what do men and women do, well, people react to the fact that we have conscripted women to this sphere and men to this sphere, and it's been wrong and unhealthy. But what we're missing is it's way more than who's earning money. It's down to the very levels of our physiological makeup that is different, that offers a unique complementary way of relating to children and enabling their development. I was so grateful to study it and pull it out. And every time I talk about it, students are like, they're just amazed when they think about what my dad did and what my mom did and how they were distinct and that I didn't know. And yet it's been helpful to me.
I felt that same amazement. I was really impressed. These are things we sort of intuitively know, a lot of them, not everything. I certainly didn't know everything I learned from reading the article, but a lot of it is a sort of, that comports exactly with my lived experience.
Yes. And I think that's what we do. Is social science is an effort to capture lived experience. And so when we have doctrinal teachings about that, and we see, for example, this division in creation of earth and water and dark and night and moon and stars and all these divisions going on in creation, And it culminates in this division of men and women
Mm-hmm.
who Christ's whole work is to bring back into full oneness together. But this pattern of interdependence that is woven, it seems like, into eternity is so beautifully manifest in male-female oneness that enables both life to be created and life to develop. And that's what we see in the research. It matches what that doctrine teaches us.
Thank you. Professor Erickson, I wanted to ask you to comment on this statement you make on page 11 of your article. You say, neither the father nor the mother is subordinate to each other. Rather, their intertwining differences reveal a complementarity that is measurably significant in facilitating healthy development.
Yes. Now, the purpose of the article is to elucidate what research shows us about these distinct contributions that mothers and fathers bring in their just physiological makeup, in who they are as man and woman, that uniquely, and not entirely uniquely, meaning there's a lot of overlap between what men and women do. Men can nurture, they can bond, they can do all of those things. But what we see is, if you thought of a Venn diagram, and there's a lot of overlap, on the outsides of these margins are really significant, distinct, physiologically hardwired contributions that are important to development. And that's what research is kind of elucidating for us.
As I read, I was struck with the thought, as you know well, this is controversial stuff.
Yes.
And there will be all kinds of counterclaims and so forth.
Yes.
I was struck with the nature of the studies that you're talking about, the research. This is not biased stuff, right? Some of these studies were government studies. Will you say more about the nature of the research that you've mined here?
Yes, so happy to. Sometimes we do research that's just observing men and women and those differences. And I do cite some of that research. Sometimes we're looking at how this shows up in terms of development as more predictive. So a mother's presence or her way of being as more predictive of certain things. And so it is sophisticated research.
Very.
And it's sensitive, I think, for a reason, because as we described before, in many ways, post-industrialization, pre-industrialization, men and women were together on the farm. She was doing meaningful economic work. They worked together. They were in kind of separate, certainly my great-grandparents did different things in those environments. But then when we have this division, and women were conscripted to a sphere that had lost in many ways its meaning. She's now a consumer, not a producer. And he's in this world of work, and she's to create this haven that he just comes home to rest. And I think a couple of things happened. One is that she was narrowly conscripted in her sphere of influence. That needed to change. And men, we obscured what they do as fathers.
Yeah.
They all of a sudden only became a worker. And so a reaction to her conscription was to say, we're equals. We can do equal things. She can contribute in that sphere. He can contribute in this sphere. But in the effort politically, I think, and culturally, then we lost a sense of the importance of both as unique people, as by design, needed to both be part of that work of nurturing and providing and protecting, presiding.
Not a matter of who's better than who, but absolute complementarity is absolutely essential to get the best situation, right?
Yes.
I was so impressed by that. The case you make is overwhelming, I think. Children are best blessed and best nurtured with a mother and a father that are in their presence.
And I think a child would say that, right? When my husband was asked by his mother at the point of their divorce when he was 6, who do you want to live with? And he describes that moment with so much poignancy still. And he could not answer. He couldn't answer his mom.
What an awful dilemma.
An awful dilemma for a child, yes. Now, sometimes divorce is absolutely the right thing. And his father was very good at staying close. His mom was very good at staying close. That benefited him tremendously. And
made the best of the complementarity.
Yes, that's right. Yes, but it is designed to be a unit where the distinction of in a man's body, his voice, his everything, and hers, that a child is benefited. And it's so interesting to see in the research, just by that difference being present, they come to understand themselves in relation to both being present. and it expands their cognitive understanding, their way to relate with other people as they watch their parents and their differences work out things together. All of that really becomes important in magnifying the developmental process.
I was fascinated even by what you said about just vocabulary.
Yes.
Is richer and better if you've got a mom and dad to shape your vocabulary.
We laugh all the time that, so the paper describes social emotional development, cognitive development, sexual development, gender understanding, as well as safety and protection. And in the cognitive side, it's fascinating because mothers intuitively seem to have a sense of what a child will understand. They're very good at providing richness in quantity of language, and that is within access to that child's understanding. Dads don't seem to care. I'll tell Mike half the time, they understood maybe a half of what you just said, right? His vocabulary. But what's so interesting is it shows that fathers tend to impact the expanse, stretching of that vocabulary. And they'll engage with more difficult patterns of conversation that require that child to kind of step up. And so you just see, even in that way, that they're complementary.
Yeah.
Dads are the most important. I think for a long time, we knew mothers matter. Since John Bowlby came up with attachment theory in the early 1900s, it was clear there is something very powerful about the bond that an infant forms. They come out looking for a bond. It's essential for brain development. It's essential for them creating a framework for understanding themselves in relationship to others. It's essential for emotion regulation, for well-being in all kinds of ways. We know attachment is a big deal. That child comes out wired to look for the mother. The mother's wired to look for that baby. The baby knows her smell, her heartbeat, her sound, her face. They have a part in the brain that's bigger for woman's face. So they're more drawn. They'll spend more time looking at a woman's face and their mothers especially. We knew that. And so emotionally, she is absolutely fundamental to development. Now, that doesn't mean that a child who doesn't get a healthy attachment is destined to a difficult, horrible life, but we know it's very important and that it sets children on a trajectory that's higher risk in all those ways.
Right.
But what did dads do? And that was sort of the question. Does a dad do anything that way? And so I think it's fascinating with cognitive development that mothers lay sort of a foundation for the capacity to learn in that attachment relationship. And he comes in and just builds on it and expands it. So fathers are very important we know relationship with father is the strongest predictor of college graduation of all the major variables we can identify. Isn't that fascinating? Yeah. And he's more likely to push a child to demonstrate that they know a skill or that they can express something. He's much more likely to sit back and say, you can do this, where mothers are more likely to intervene and help them. He's more likely to use bigger kind of vocabulary words or harder kind of language structures. And it's as if dads provide this combination of sort of expectation, pulling back, saying you can do it, structure, and financial support that's just really powerful.
That is my upbringing to a T, right? As you say that, I can think about that. And if you were to say to me, would you rather have your mom's nurturing or your dad's? I'd say, I needed my mom.
Yes.
My mom protected me from the terrible vulnerability of my most embarrassing moments. She's just really, really great.
Yeah.
She said just key things that were so protective and nurturing. And my dad led me to expect you can do hard stuff. I expect you to do. I expect you to work hard. I expect you to do challenging things. I expect you to fail and then get back up. And, and which of those would you do without, right? There's just this wonderful complementarity that I can see so clearly now that you've taught me what it is that I'm seeing. I really appreciate that about the article.
You really do need both.
Yeah.
I loved reading Andrew Doucet, who ends up studying stay-at-home fathers in Canada, where we had more of that. We had more stay-at-home fathers earlier than we did in the United States. And she's going in there and she's looking at how do they relate to children different than mothers. And she notices right off, okay, dads are saying when it's lunchtime, go make your own lunch and put on your own backpack and tie your own shoes before it's time to go to school. She's with moms and it's lunch, and that mom says, do you want it cut in like moons or square, and what kind of sandwich do you want? And at first she's thinking, these disengaged dads, like engage, Bob.
Yeah.
Like, where are the men in this, right? But just as you described, it was very illuminating to her to recognize nurturing includes both holding close and letting go. And that there's something very powerful, not that fathers don't hold close and not that mothers don't push independence, but it seems like they highlight certain dimensions in ways that provide a wholeness to that.
Right.
That's really, really helpful.
Truly. My mother said to me one time, my job is to make it so you don't need me anymore. And
it's a horrible thing to ask mothers to do, right?
But she did it in exactly the way you're talking about, right? She prepared me to be independent in a way that was different from the complementary way that my father did.
Yeah,
and
that's beautiful.
I'm the better off for both influences. So tell us about how mothers hold their infants in ways that show them their face and are close to them, and fathers hold infants in ways that show them the world, sort of put them out to the world. Can you say more about that?
This was Mike and I completely. But what's interesting so we've talked through the cognitive side a little bit. The social emotional side is so interesting because we knew attachment's building social emotional capacity. It's all mother right brain to right brain, which is the center for social emotional regulation, identity, well-being. And we knew that mattered. So what are dads doing? Well, here's Mike and I. And I was the young women president during the time that we had LaDawn. And so when I had her, he had to take her during church. This was 3-hour church. The very first thing he does is hold her like a football. And this is a man who has no younger children. He has no siblings. He was not raised around cousins. The first diaper he changed was ours, LaDawn's, 35 years old, right? He had no interactions with baby. He puts her immediately in that. I'm studying this a year after this and reading about how fathers tend to do this. Mothers don't do that. They tend to hold the baby, looking, as you described, looking at the face or close to her. And dads tend to hold babies with giving them a view of the outside world. That's exactly what we were doing. And it was interesting because it's sort of representative of their distinct contributions social emotionally. Almost like she's building core understanding and he's doing a remarkable work in helping that child know how to relate to the outside world. So he's giving this baby this view of the outside world. We know dads tend to help children understand boundaries around what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Just by his sheer presence, he gives a sense of authority. And women tend to discipline children from a relational standpoint, where he tends to discipline from a sense of authority. So, for example, women will correct children much more often. They tend to intervene and don't do this, do that. Dads don't. But when they do, the boundary holds. That's so interesting.
You are telling my story.
Which is how, and who knew, right? And yet children need the flexibility of the relational way of relating, and they need to know there is a boundary I cannot cross. And so that's why I think father-child is connected to incarceration rates, to behaviors that are outside social normativity. We know that dads play, which is so fascinating. Right off Ross Park, this scholar starts noting, dads play with kids very differently than moms do. You open a room and there's kids playing on the floor with a parent, roughhousing, it's going to be dad. Not that moms don't do that, but it's just a different inclination that way. And so he's looking at, does it mean anything in terms of children's development? Why are dads doing this weird behavior? And he finds out it's linked to how children are viewed by their peers. And as they're doing more research, fathers in that kind of play help a child figure out how to govern their emotions, not bite, not hit, not be out of control, play in a heightened emotional state in some ways, in a way that can be somewhat aggressive or assertive without being out of control. And dads do that in a way that's very special. That's a social emotional capacity, right? That mothers don't have the same inclination toward facilitating.
This is fascinating stuff. I really appreciate it. Help us understand the contributions parents make to sexual development. That was an important part of what you wrote about.
It's really important, and it's painful sometimes for me to do that research. But Bruce Ellis, a scholar out of Arizona, started looking at, especially in the era when we had high rates of teen pregnancy and girls in promiscuous, dangerous relationships, and why are they there? And he's finding a link with family structure. So girls growing up without fathers seem to be at greater risk for teen pregnancy. More research on that, and it's very sophisticated because he ends up looking at sibling daughters. Divorce happens, and one of the daughters is older than the younger daughter. Did it impact the fact that a father was not at home anymore? Did it impact that sexual trajectory? And he finds out that girls whose fathers left the home earlier were at a much increased risk for engaging with men in ways that were sexually unhelpful and unhealthy to them. It's not just his presence, though his presence matters. It gives a sense of protection, almost like she walks out of the house with a sense of there's someone watching over me whose love is not sexually driven and who's going to be protective of me. That presence matters, but it's also his emotional closeness to her. And so they would say as strongly as he sets the sexual trajectory of her life, which is really strong language.
Yeah.
But it's that important. Dad-daughter relationship is that important. And not to say that it doesn't matter for sons, because in a complementary way, it's as if that father's relationship with his son gives him an understanding of what protective love looks like, that's pro-woman, pro-child, that's a masculinity that is governed in a way that's protective, as opposed to aggressive or sexually driven. Mm-hmm. And so that boy, it's interesting how boys without fathers appear to develop a kind of compensatory masculinity, that it's a distortion of true masculinity that is inclined towards more abusive patterns. So
this is fascinating and both extremely encouraging, but also discouraging on the flip side.
Yes, serious, right?
Yeah.
It's a serious issue.
Yeah. Well, I'm thankful to know it. Again, there's so many of these things that you taught in the article that I learned from my own parents or just intuitively did, but without understanding, without really realizing it. And it's just extremely encouraging as a father. I was telling you that I often feel inadequate and, like I'm not measuring up. And one of the things that I was so delighted by in your article is I came away from feeling not just educated, but edified. I thought, I'm making a difference. Not that I can't do better and so on, but I'm just by being on the job of being a dad and not doing it flawlessly, I'm offering protections and advantages, and I'm thankful about that. I always knew that about my wife.
Yes.
But I feel a little bit more like maybe I'm helping out too.
Yeah.
And I didn't expect the emotional edification and encouragement that I felt. I sort of expected to be educated, but not so much edified. I really appreciate that about what you wrote.
I think you have tapped into something very critical, which is my male students, they do not know how important they are. I think in an economically transitioned world around providing, there's no question our men are floundering, our young men are floundering. They're not achieving it in the same way that they did. The gap between men and women, between girls and boys, is greater than it was on the flip in the 1970s in terms of educational achievement. And there has been a loss in the sense that I am needed. I matter to this world, and my manhood matters to this world. And so I love sharing with them, you, as you are, with your masculinity, and a virtuous masculinity is one of the most important forces in this world. We absolutely have to have it, as much as we have to have the nurturing of women and their unique emotional capacities, their strengths that way that are distinct in them. We need one another. We cannot have a world without them. That's why that story that I tell from Canada, that these stay-at-home dads.
This is right at the beginning of your article.
Right at the beginning. It was so powerful to both Andrea Doucet, who captured that, and me. But as they describe this meeting where they're trying to support these fathers that are single fathers in this incredibly difficult work, any single parent knows this, right? They are trying to do it all. And it's an incredible task. And so they're asking these men, what would help you? In an ideal world, what would be there for you? And it was quiet. She says, these men were silent. And then one stood up and said, it cannot be an ideal world without mothers for the children. And just so powerful. He could have said anything. And he's just saying what we all know is what we would want for our children is for them to have caring, devoted mothers alongside caring, devoted fathers. Now, that is not our world. And I love that research shows there are a lot of people without that research shows there's a lot that can be compensated. So children without those, by having loving priesthood leaders, bishops, others who help them, young men leaders, they're unbelievably important. And the same with women who influence those children that are outside that familial structure. We can see from the research the power of that compensatory involvement. The important thing is that we try to, in every way, protect that ideal. And then that we recognize we need men and women walking beside one another in this influence on the development of the next generation. At church, at home, in our communities, at schools, all of those places.
Thank you. That was very beautifully said.
Thank you. Such a privilege to talk about it.